Hi, I'm Felix Pastorius, and you're watching for BassPlayersOnly.com.
Hi everyone, I'm John Liebman. You're watching for BassPlayersOnly.com. Today we are here with a very special guest, Felix Pastorius. How you doing, Felix?
Great, John. Thanks for having me.
It's great to see you. I want to talk about you because obviously you had a very famous father. So I want to talk a little bit about him, and then I want to talk about you because you are an artist, a formidable artist in your own right. But you were very young when your father died, and I'm just curious as to how you would describe your musical upbringing. How did you become a musician specifically? How did you learn? Was it obvious that you chose the bass because of your father? Did that happen naturally? Or, how would you describe your musical upbringing?
Well, music was, as I hope it would be in most people's households, it was an everyday life, part of life. Granted, most of the music we did listen to happened to have my father and my twin brother, our father, featured on it. So we listened to a lot of his music growing up, but other artists and other genres as well. But on top of that, we were also surrounded by instruments. Our household had almost every instrument, and we were encouraged to play all of them. And because of my father passing so young, it was really solely on my mother's shoulders to make sure that we at least were aware of the option to play music. She didn't keep us away from it, even though music can be, and she saw it firsthand, music can be a rough industry. And this is even pre iTunes and Napster, where it's actually even much more difficult nowadays to be an artist and a musician. But she didn't keep us from it. She encouraged us. So my upbringing was through, I had a piano teacher. Well, actually, my twin brother and I, we had a violin teacher at first when we were 5, which was very short-lived because it's violin and we're 5, so those two don't mix well, as you could probably imagine.
For you or for the people listening?
All of the above. I didn't enjoy that much either. And then a couple years later, when we have a little more, control over our dexterity and everything, we attempted piano and guitar, and that was it wasn't very advanced, and by no means was it like classical or anything like that, but it was at least an introduction to music, reading, not really so much theory, but reading and playing simple tunes, and but for some reason, and I don't know if it's subconsciously or what, or maybe the music we were listening to, or maybe just had something to do with because of how much more fun we had on other instruments. My brother and I never really practiced our individual instruments. Me on piano and my twin brother Julius on guitar. We would sight read our lessons, and then we would sight read the lesson, then we get next week's lesson so we could work on it, but we would never practice.
Teachers know when you practice and when you don't.
We would just sight read the practice every week. Or the lesson every week, and during the week we would play other instruments and whatever.
Excuse me, you're talking about approximately what age right now?
7.
Okay.
Yeah, 7, 8. A few years we went with this, and so we were playing all the other instruments in the house. I loved playing drums. Julius loved playing drums. Bass. We had basses in the house at that point too. We had accordion, saxophone, guitar, all these different things, and we were just kind of goofing around and having fun. But it was always more fun, also as a young boy who's usually full of energy, to play something that's a little more physical, and you could, during the weekends maybe turn up a little bit louder and have more fun. Drums and bass. So it kind of gradually fell more into that, and.
Sounds like music immersion.
Yeah, And again, I don't know if it was subconsciously, because drums and bass was our father's first instruments as well. The drums for him first, and then bass. And I don't know if it was because of the attention that we knew that our father garnered because of his musicianship, but it kind of gradually went in that direction unintentionally. Personally, I think it's unintentionally. Who knows though? But again, our mother encouraged us to do really whatever we want to in terms of music, and brought us to go see live music as much as possible, even at very young ages. Going to New York and going to Sweet Basil's, or wherever. And
you could get into Sweet Basil's?
Well, it was, it depended on the night, but yeah, usually we were getting in. That's the benefit somewhat, of having a father who was,
Who was Jaco.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. We were fortunate in a lot of situations in terms of getting to know musicians at a very young age, without even really knowing how important their lives were and their careers were to the arts and to music in general. So. Where was I going with this? So we were eventually, as we started working a little bit more on practicing drums and bass more, and we ended up finishing our endeavors with piano and guitar, which helped somewhat. That was my initiation to I guess classical learning in some sense, in terms of reading, and writing, and not so much theory. Theory came later when I started teaching myself theory. But we eventually started a trio with a friend of ours, and played a couple gigs, and got a little more into it. And then I was asked to join. Bobby Thomas was Thomas Jr. percussionist.
I know Bobby. Sure.
Yeah, right. With the Weather Report. Bobby asked me to join his band at that time it was called Bermuda Triangle. It was a trio with this vibraphonist Tom Toyama.
I went to school with Tom.
You know Tom
sure.
also?
He's from Hawaii.
Yeah. So I was 15, and I had been playing bass now for maybe 4 years, but again, it was just in our living room. And the type of gigs that we had prior was really simple things, and like calling out chord changes type of thing, or not even chords. I wasn't even that advanced at that point. And maybe learning 2 songs and then going playing it out, So, but Bobby asked me to join, and this was gigs in South Beach at Jazzid, and and my mom would have to drive me because I didn't have a license. And the gigs were normally going at least till 2-3 a.m. in the morning, because it is South Beach. And I didn't know very much. I was teaching myself, as I still am today. I knew Purple Haze, and I knew the pentatonic scale. And all the songs were made up on the spot. And nothing. We played 2 or 3 gigs before we had our first rehearsal, and the rehearsal wasn't even working on original music.
2 or 3 gigs before you had a rehearsal, or 2 or 3 rehearsals before you had?
Gigs before we
right.
had. Before we had a rehearsal, and the first rehearsal wasn't even going over. Going over material tunes or anything. It was to go over. Tom and Bobby had come up with the idea that they would. Like in sports, we were going to have hand gestures to signal like turnarounds, or key changes, or certain things. So they would do some kind of baseball, whatever, and
hard to do when your hands are busy playing your instrument. But I'm curious about your bass technique, because you play like you don't play like your father exactly. You don't play like anyone else. I lived in Florida for 6 years, and I knew your father. I didn't know him that well, but he had me over to the house. I remember jamming with him in the living room, and he's showing me the fingerings to Teen Town. Very, very special moments for me. But I'm curious as to, you referenced teaching yourself theory. What about bass technique? I remember asking him, I said, I read one time that you took a year off just to practice. What did you practice during that year? And he looked me right in the eye, and he kind of shrugged, and he said, nothing but scales, and he played it real slowly, a C major scale. It was on a fretted bass, but he played it as if it was a fretless. For some reason, that stuck in my mind. But what about you and your bass technique? How did you go about, how did you approach it, and how did you and how do you develop it?
So technique for me is it's in terms of practice, and it kind of falls under this. I know a lot of bass players and even drummers or any rhythm musicians will probably go tisk tisk towards me for saying this, but I don't practice rhythm either very much, or technique specifically, because both of those things for me, those categories of music fall under necessity of the situation of what's going on. I think you have to have a basic understanding of what it means to get a clear tone, to work on sound. But I also believe that comes through repetition, and same thing as far as rhythm or learning grooves. I think that really comes through music, learning tunes, learning to play with certain musicians. Every musician has their own vocabulary. So to me, it's being in a playing situation more that makes, it necessity is the mother of invention. So it kind of just happens through needing it to happen. But you have to at least understand and have a basic concept and understanding of what a good sound is, and and how not to hurt yourself. That's another big part of technique for me, at least, is figuring out a way not to hurt yourself. Make sure you're relaxed at straight wrists and all these different things, and breathing. But technique, yeah, I mean, I practice simple things every day. I rarely practice very difficult things. To me, practicing a difficult thing is maybe transcribing a solo or learning a difficult head. But for the most part, my technique comes from, and rhythm and feel comes from practicing with a metronome and practicing scales and arpeggios and very simple things, actually.
You like to do, I've seen you perform live, and I've seen you fool around and warm up, and you like to stretch your fingers in a way that would be very uncomfortable for me, but it looks very natural to you. Do you use fingerings similar to your father's, or do you how did you come up with that?
Well, I haven't really studied too much of my father's fingerings. I've attempted some of his solos, and it's easy to tell where his open strings are, but in terms of the fingered notes, it's never really sure. I mean, a lot of it I have no idea how he plays it still to this day. Just listening to it, not even trying to play it, just listening. It's just like, how is that even possible? But for me, my hands are large, so the stretches might look uncomfortable, but it feels natural to me, and a stretch is something that I incorporate in some of my teaching with my students. But again, it's for accessibility. It's for movement. It's to create a movement up and down the neck, to try not to get away from being stagnant in positions, which bass players can often get in, one place and then one place and then one place.